the Supreme Court has delivered a devastating blow to Prime Minister Keir Starmer's government, marking a political disaster of his own making. As hard-working Britons continue to struggle with rising bills, Starmer has been accused of quietly funneling taxpayer money into foreign deals and cozying up to EU elites, bypassing democratic processes, and pushing policies the public never voted for. Now, the Supreme Court has slammed the brakes on his controversial foreign agenda, exposing his government's overreach for all to see. This isn't just a legal defeat, it's a political earthquake. How bad is it when the highest court in the land has to step in to stop a prime minister's secretive plans? The Supreme Court has officially ruled against a key aspect of Starmer's foreign policy, effectively blocking his attempts to forge closer ties with the European Union. This ruling marks the first major legal challenge to Starmer's government and has thrown his leadership into chaos. At the heart of the decision is Starmer's quiet push to realign Britain with EU regulations, a plan disguised as pragmatic diplomacy. His government argued that closer cooperation with Brussels was necessary for economic stability, but critics warned it was a backdoor attempt to reverse Brexit without public consent. Now, the Supreme Court has delivered its verdict: Starmer's policies are not legally sound. Sources close to the case suggest the ruling specifically targets the legislative maneuvers Starmer's administration tried to fast-track through Parliament. These measures aimed at aligning certain UK trade laws with EU standards have now been deemed unconstitutional, halting Starmer's strategy in its tracks. For months, opposition figures and legal experts warned that Starmer was overstepping his authority, attempting to reshape Britain's global position without a clear mandate from the public. The Supreme Court has now confirmed their fears, exposing Starmer's government as operating in legally dubious territory. The consequences could be devastating. This ruling sends a clear message: Starmer cannot rewrite Britain's post-Brexit relationship without facing major legal roadblocks. It also raises a critical question: was this a careless misstep, or has Starmer been deliberately working behind the scenes to reverse Brexit by stealth? Either way, his government is now in serious trouble, and the fallout from this decision is only just beginning. Starmer's government is in total disarray. The Supreme Court's ruling has not only shattered his foreign policy ambitions but also ignited a political firestorm within his own party. Labour MPs who once stood firmly behind Starmer are now questioning whether he is the right leader to take them into the next election. Senior figures within the party are reportedly furious, accusing Starmer of recklessly pushing a secret EU agenda without considering the legal and political consequences. Many within Labour's ranks had already been uneasy about Starmer's stance on European relations, and this ruling has exposed the true extent of his overreach. What was once dismissed as speculation, that Starmer was covertly trying to rebind Britain to Brussels, now seems undeniable, confirmed not by political opponents but by the highest court in the land. This has left Labour deeply divided, with growing murmurs of discontent among backbenchers who fear Starmer's leadership is becoming a liability. Behind closed doors, the fallout is becoming impossible to ignore. Reports of heated arguments among Starmer's closest advisers are emerging, with many scrambling to salvage the government's credibility. Some within Labour are even calling for a complete overhaul of the party's foreign policy strategy, fearing Starmer's miscalculation has handed the opposition a significant advantage. The timing of this ruling couldn't be worse for Starmer. Just as he was trying to present himself as a strong and stable leader ahead of a potential general election, his credibility has been dealt a devastating blow. Even his staunchest allies are beginning to waver, with some privately admitting this ruling could have long-term consequences for Labour's chances at the ballot box. Starmer built his political persona on being competent, measured, and legally precise. Now, the Supreme Court has publicly exposed the flaws in his approach, showing that even his so-called pragmatic diplomacy was riddled with legal vulnerabilities. The damage is not just legal, it's deeply political, shaking the very foundation of his claim to leadership. Meanwhile, the opposition is wasting no time capitalizing on this disaster. The Conservatives and Reform UK have both seized the moment, declaring that this ruling proves Starmer was never truly committed to Brexit. Prominent Brexiteers are calling it the final nail in the coffin of Starmer's credibility, demanding he publicly admit his intentions to bring Britain back under EU influence. Nigel Farage, never one to miss an opportunity, has issued a scathing statement calling Starmer's secret EU agenda a direct betrayal of the British people and urging voters to reject Labour's attempts to surrender UK sovereignty. Even Rishi Sunak, who has been under immense political pressure himself, sees this as an opportunity to regain the upper hand. Downing Street insiders claim Sunak's team is already working on a strategy to hammer Starmer on this issue, portraying him as untrustworthy and willing to undermine Brexit through backdoor legal maneuvers. With a general election on the horizon, this ruling could become a defining issue, turning Starmer's miscalculation into a political disaster that could haunt him for years to come. And the worst part? This might just be the beginning. With the Supreme Court's ruling in place, Starmer faces an even bigger crisis. What happens next? Can he defy the ruling and push forward with his foreign policy regardless, or will he be forced into a humiliating climb down, proving once and for all that his leadership is weaker than ever? Starmer is now facing the single biggest legal crisis of his political career, and the walls are closing in fast. The Supreme Court's ruling didn't just strike down his foreign policy, it set the stage for a massive constitutional battle that could define his entire leadership. The problem is simple but devastating. Starmer has spent years portraying himself as a man of the law, a former director of public prosecutions who understands the legal system better than anyone. Now, that very system has turned against him, exposing his agenda as not just politically reckless but legally indefensible. The question haunting his government is this: what happens next? Can Starmer backtrack and pretend this never happened, or will he fight back against the ruling, plunging his government into an even deeper crisis? The legal ramifications of the Supreme Court's decision are massive. By ruling against Starmer's foreign policy moves, the court has effectively blocked his government from making key international agreements without proper parliamentary oversight. This means any secret negotiations Starmer had with EU officials or any attempts to bring the UK closer to Brussels without full transparency are now dead in the water. But more than that, this ruling has sent shockwaves through the legal and political establishment, raising urgent questions about Starmer's decision-making process. Did he truly believe he could bypass legal scrutiny, or was he so confident in his political dominance that he ignored warnings from legal experts? Either way, this decision has placed Starmer in an impossible position. He must now choose between openly defying the highest court in the land or admitting that his foreign policy is in shambles. If Starmer chooses to defy the ruling, the consequences will be catastrophic. Ignoring a Supreme Court decision would trigger a full-blown constitutional crisis, sparking legal challenges from opposition parties, businesses, and possibly even his own MPs. Legal experts are warning that any attempt to circumvent the court's decision would be met with immediate lawsuits, further damaging Labour's reputation and dragging Starmer's government into an endless legal battle. And it's not just the courts he needs to worry about. Senior civil servants within Whitehall are reportedly furious at how the government handled this situation. There are even whispers that some high-ranking officials may resign in protest if Starmer tries to push ahead with his plans despite the legal ruling. This is the kind of chaos no leader wants, and yet it's the exact scenario Starmer has walked into by overplaying his hand on foreign policy. On the other hand, if Starmer chooses to accept the ruling and abandon his foreign policy objectives, the political damage will be just as severe. A complete climb down would confirm what many have suspected all along, that Starmer's leadership is weak, indecisive, and easily derailed by legal obstacles. It would give the opposition the perfect ammunition to label him as a failed leader who can't even get his own policies past the courts. The Conservative Party has already begun framing the ruling as a sign that Starmer is not fit to govern, pointing to the fact that no Prime Minister in recent history has suffered such a public legal defeat over foreign policy. It's not just the Tories sharpening their knives. Within Labour, calls for Starmer to take responsibility are growing louder by the day. Labour insiders are now in full panic mode, scrambling to come up with a damage control strategy. Some are pushing for Starmer to issue a carefully worded statement acknowledging the ruling but downplaying its significance. Others are urging him to shift focus onto domestic policies, hoping voters will forget about this legal disaster by the time the next election rolls around. But deep down, even Starmer's closest allies know this isn't something that can be brushed aside. This ruling has exposed fundamental weaknesses in Starmer's leadership. It has shown he is not in control, that his decision-making is flawed, and that his ambitions for the UK's foreign policy are being dictated not by democratic mandate, but by secretive and legally questionable maneuvers. This is where the real danger lies. Now, Starmer's opponents have an opportunity they've been waiting for, the chance to dig deeper, to uncover more about his foreign policy dealings, and to expose what other legal vulnerabilities his government might be hiding. If the Supreme Court was willing to strike down this policy, what else might they rule against in the future? Are there more legal battles on the horizon that could further destabilize Starmer's government? Perhaps the most critical question of all is, was this ruling just the beginning of a much larger unraveling of Labour's agenda? The pressure is mounting, and Starmer is running out of time to respond. Every minute he delays a clear decision, the crisis deepens, and his grip on power weakens. Will he stand firm and fight the court's decision, risking a constitutional war that could bring down his government, or will he retreat, admitting defeat and proving his critics right? Either way, the damage has already been done, and the road ahead is looking increasingly treacherous. But the real nightmare for Starmer's government is that it's now spiraling into full-blown crisis mode. The Supreme Court ruling has set off a political earthquake that Labour was completely unprepared for. The immediate aftermath has been nothing short of catastrophic. Within hours of the ruling, opposition leaders, legal experts, and even Starmer's own party members were in open rebellion. What started as a legal setback has now transformed into a defining moment for Starmer's leadership, one that could decide not only the fate of his government, but also the future of the Labour Party itself. The cracks that were once hidden beneath the surface are now widening, and the once solid foundation of Labour's unity is beginning to crumble under the weight of political infighting, public outrage, and growing distrust in Starmer's ability to lead. The first and most immediate impact has been the reaction from the Conservative Party. Tory MPs wasted no time capitalising on the ruling, launching a brutal attack on Starmer's credibility. The message was clear. Labour's leader had been exposed as a reckless politician who thought he could bypass the law, only to be humiliated by the very institution he once upheld. Conservative strategists are already using this ruling to shape their narrative ahead of the next general election, framing Starmer as weak, untrustworthy, and incapable of managing Britain's foreign policy. They argue that if he can't even navigate the legal system on key international issues, how can he be trusted with the country's economy, security, or Brexit negotiations? For voters already skeptical of Starmer's leadership, this ruling only reinforces their doubts, making it harder for Labour to convince the public they are the right choice for government. But while the Tories are seizing the moment, the real political chaos is happening inside Labour itself. The ruling has marked a civil war within Starmer's own party, with different factions blaming each other for the disaster. The moderate pro-EU wing of Labour is furious that Starmer's miscalculation has made it even harder to push their agenda of closer ties with Brussels. Some are now openly questioning whether Starmer has the political skill to deliver on his promises, especially if every major policy move is going to be met with legal resistance. Meanwhile, the left-wing faction of Labour, the very group Starmer has tried to distance himself from, is accusing him of betraying the party's values by attempting to align with the EU at the expense of national sovereignty. This group is now calling for a fundamental shift in Labour's approach, arguing that Starmer's compromises have alienated voters and led them straight into the hands of the Tories. The result is a deeply fractured Labour Party, no longer united behind its leader, and with its own future now in jeopardy. In the end, the Supreme Court ruling has left Starmer trapped. His credibility is shattered, his policies are in tatters, and his leadership is in serious question. The Labour Party now faces a crossroads, one that could determine its survival. If Starmer can't find a way to rally his party and present a clear vision for Britain's future, the next election could become Labour's most disastrous defeat in modern history. And even if Starmer manages to stay in power, this ruling will remain a dark cloud hanging over his leadership, reminding the public of just how far he is willing to go to achieve his political ambitions, even if it means sacrificing the will of the people.